Leif Erikson sailed further than any Viking before him, creating a legacy that echoed through seaports for centuries. But his final chapter took a dark and mysterious turn. Like any good Viking saga, Leif Erikson's story starts many years before he was born, with a stain on his family that would seep through generations. His father, Eric the Red, one of the biggest Viking explorers of his generation, grew up under the shadow of his father Thorvald's sins. When Eric was still young and growing up in Norway, Thorvald was banished from the country for committing manslaughter. It began an itinerant existence that would shape Leif Erikson's life, but it also began a pattern of bloodshed. Eric had very little options when it came to resettling his family. Straight off, he took an expedition to explore the largely uninhabited land of Greenland, leaving Leif and the rest of his brood so he could make a proper survey of the place and suss out its settlement possibilities. When Leif's father finally came back, he had big news for his son. Eric the Red was now obsessed with settling the so-called Greenland, which he had named to emphasize its apparently Edenic qualities next to Iceland, and took his wife and children over there along with a handful of other colonists to make a go of it. It was in these barren lands that Leif Erikson got perhaps his first lucky break. Leif's father was a larger-than-life figure, and he had sold larger-than-life expectations for the colonial journey to Greenland. It ended with tragedy. Although 25 ships had set sail for the land, only 14 of them arrived on its shores. 11 of those boats had simply turned back, but the rest were likely lost at sea. The constant drama was already leaving a mark on Leif. Leif was still around his pre-teen years at this time, but had lived in near constant and violent turmoil, likely since he could remember. He had no fixed home, and his new abode was an intimidating work in progress, with long hours spent building villages until his family's settlement grew to 5,000 people. It's no wonder then that Leif grew up with wandering feet, but he wasn't exactly like his father. When Leif was a proper age, he had a long-delayed homecoming. He travelled to his ancestral home of Norway at last, most probably to work as King Olaf Tryggvason's retainer at the royal court. But before he could make it there, at least according to the saga of Eric the Red, he hit a snag that would trigger an Odyssey. While heading to Norway, Leif was at the mercy of the winds, and the winds didn't feel particularly merciful toward him. His ship got pushed into the Hebrides, off the west coast of what is now the Scottish mainland, and the traveller and his crew had to hunker down for the summer while they waited for a better wind pattern. As it happened, it was a date with destiny. While in the Hebrides, Leif experienced a whirlwind romance. Still young and rash, he fell in love with the noble woman Thorgunna, and their passionate tryst produced a son, Thorgils. In another version of Leif's story, he may have stopped travelling entirely after this, and settled down with his love. But that simply wasn't Leif Erikson. When the winds picked up in a better direction, Leif barely gave it a second thought before choosing to leave the Hebrides and continue on to Norway, as he'd always planned. But he gave up something crucial. Thorgunna's parents apparently wouldn't let her go with Leif, and the Strickler Viking refused to bring her without their say-so. It wasn't what his father would have done, but Leif was willing to make the sacrifice for honor. Besides, there was another adventure on the horizon. After leaving his lover and child in the Hebrides, Leif finally landed in Norway and immediately began serving King Olaf. Being Leif, he likely took all his duties seriously and performed them diligently, all while taking in the sights and culture of his ancestral land. But Leif's dedicated nature actually got him into more drama than not. At the time, King Olaf was something of a zealot for the Christian religion, and Norway was a Christian nation. The king introduced the Norse Vikings to the religion, and Leif reportedly found himself responding to it. He quickly converted body and soul to Christianity, so much so that Olaf asked him for an enormous favour. Seeing how devout his Viking vassal was, Olaf gave Leif a dangerous mission. He was to go back to the settlement of Greenland and convert as many of the settlers there as he could to Christianity. In this, Leif was particularly excited to convert his mother and father to his new religion. But he was in for a nasty surprise. When Leif did finally make it back to Greenland, he arrived with all the optimism of the newly converted and brought the good news to his parents. His father, however, was incensed at the suggestion. The hot-headed Eric was just fine with his Norse rituals and wanted nothing to do with this newfangled sect. His mother, however, was another story. Perhaps Leif's mother was a little more like her son than his father, because she eagerly adopted the religion. In fact, she built the first Christian church in Greenland, much to Eric the Red's displeasure. One saga even says that Leif's new religion caused such a rift in the family, his mother began withholding intimacy from Eric the Red. But Leif had little time for these troubles. He was about to become a legend. Sometime around this period, accounts vary about exactly when, Leif Erikson made the greatest discovery of his life. In between Leif leaving Norway and landing in Greenland to spread the word, bad winds forced him off course again and set him down on a wholly unfamiliar shore. When Leif and his crew disembarked, they made startling observations. Leif wasn't just well-travelled, he came from a line of well-travelled men, yet everything about this new shore seemed foreign. He and his crew witnessed what we'd now know as wild grapes, self-sown wheat, and maple trees. Astonished at these alien goods, they packed up their ships with samples to take back with them as they corrected course back to Greenland. They had no idea what they just found, but history did. Thanks to the wild grapes they found, Leif Erikson and his men dubbed the land Vinland. However, there is ample historical evidence that, in stumbling upon his unknown shore on the way to Greenland, Leif Erikson had actually found himself in present-day Newfoundland. This makes him, not Christopher Columbus, the first European in North America. It also gave him a lasting nickname. As news about Vinland spread, and furthermore as Leif's precious Christianity spread, people couldn't help but call Eric's boy Leif the Lucky. After all, who else could be blown off course so many times and still make such momentous discoveries? Who else could convince so many people to convert to a new religion? Still, another version of events cast doubt on Leif's lucky accomplishment. According to an alternate version of events in another saga, Leif's discovery of North America was no accident. Instead, sometime earlier, fellow Norse explorer Bjarni Herjolfsson and his crew already found North American shores, though they did not disembark on them. Hearing of their discovery, Leif went to Bjarni and made quite the proposition. Perhaps eager to stake his claim to new land, in this account, Leif bought Bjarni's ship, gathered his own men, and set out explicitly in search of the land that Bjarni had found by accident. If this is the true story, then Leif may have been the first European to set foot on North America, but it is Bjarni who found it first. It's not the only way things might have been different. In an alternate history, we might have had Leif Erikson's Spitfire father as the first European in North America. According to one report, Erik was all set to join his son on this voyage to Vinland, but fell off his horse while making his way toward the ship. Seeing the accident as a bad omen, Erik the Red dropped out and robbed himself of glory. Accounts also vary as to how much involvement Leif Erikson had in settling North America, if any, though one has him merely collecting samples and never returning. Another insists Leif had a hand in creating Leif's Butter, Leif's Booths, a small settlement made after some forays into the country. At some point though, Leif's involvement did end, but the cat was out of the bag. After hearing about Vinland from Leif's crew, many other Icelanders, Greenlanders and Norse explorers began to try their luck with this alien coast. One explorer, Thorfinn Karlsefni, even followed Leif's route, with Leif's brother Thorvald in tow, in order to start a permanent settlement in the land. This never came to fruition, but the events that did unfurl were heartbreaking. When Thorfinn Karlsefni and Leif's brother landed in Vinland, they made discoveries Leif could have only imagined. Where Iceland and Greenland were mostly barren of people, Leif's successors found indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, like the Europeans who came after them, they treated the natives with contempt, giving them the name wretches. They would get their comeuppance, but it would cost Leif a family member. After some less than ideal encounters with the indigenous peoples of Vinland, including an attack on one of the Norse settlements that forced them to abandon it, Leif's brother Thorvald had a confrontation with an indigenous man. He should have run. The man promptly notched an arrow and shot it at Thorvald, killing him. Exhausted and chastened, Karlsefni's crew soon returned to Greenland. When they did, they brought more than just this news with them. After giving up on settling the already occupied land, Karlsefni still apparently wanted some token from his trip, and captured 2 indigenous boys before leaving Vinland's shores. He then took them back to Greenland, where Leif possibly had a chance to encounter them himself. By then, however, his own native home was falling to ruin. Leif Erikson did have one last lucky moment after first setting foot in North America. According to more than one saga, on his return trip back to Greenland, he came across a stranded Icelandic crew and rescued them. Another moment that went towards his Leif the Lucky nickname. Yet, while Leif saved this crew from a dark end, he couldn't save his family. Around 1000, Erik the Red's Greenland settlement was prospering, and more immigrants were coming over. But one shipload carried doom. The new arrivals brought some kind of plague or epidemic with them, and the illness began ravaging the small, isolated colony. No one was safe. Leif Erikson managed to be spared from the epidemic, another instance of his luck, but many of the community leaders were felled by the sickness, including, tragically, his father, Erik the Red. The brash man perished sometime in the winter of 1002, along with so many of his countrymen. It had far-reaching consequences for Leif. With his father gone, Leif now had a grave responsibility on his shoulders, taking over for Eric. He was now the main chieftain in the Greenland settlement. It was a role that could have easily contributed to the fact he never went back to Vinland again, and he soon found out how difficult it was to rule. Leif Erikson sailed further than any Viking before him, creating a legacy that echoed through seaports for centuries. But his final chapter took a dark turn, and many of the problems he faced came from within his own family. Leif's real trouble in ruling came, if you believe the sagas, in his sister Freydis. Taking more after their father than anyone, the ambitious Freydis asked Leif if she could go over to Vinland, seek her fortune, and make use of the structures Leif's people had built there when she landed. Leif, perhaps reluctantly, agreed. It was a disaster from beginning to end. Freydis took along two Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, to split the work and any profits they made. She then promptly betrayed them. When they landed, she assumed the use of her brother's structures and kicked them out of shelter. Shortly after, she then goaded her husband into slaying them, so she could take any profits for herself. But Leif's sister had worse up her sleeve. According to the saga that relates to Freydis' story, Leif's sister then completed their family curse. While her husband had off the brothers and their friends, he had also left 5 women from their camp living, finding himself unable to slay a woman. So Freydis channeled her father and grandfather and felled them with an axe herself. When she got back to Leif and to Greenland, her lies only continued. Vinland was something of Iceland's Wild West, and Freydis thought she could quite literally get away with murder. When she came back to her brother's realm, without the 2 men she'd set out with, she told Leif that Helgi and Finnbogi, as well as the rest of their party, had simply decided to stay in Vinland. Leif may have wanted to believe it, but the truth soon came out. Words and whispers travelled fast over the Atlantic, and Leif eventually learned of his sister's sins. His response was brutal. He tormented 3 men who had come back with Freydis and forced them to confess all the going-ons in his newly discovered land. When it came to his sister, Leif's actions were perhaps even more disturbing. Although, at least according to the account we have, Freydis was the mastermind behind these dark deeds, Leif Erikson couldn't find a way to truly punish her. He left off tormenting or even reprimanding his sister, saying only that he predicted her descendants would have little prosperity. This supposedly came true, but it was hardly a case of balanced karma. Worst of all, Leif wasn't around much longer to set it right. In the end, Leif got only spare years as Greenland's chieftain. 1018 was the last year that anyone mentioned he was alive, and by 1025, sagas report that his son Thorkel, from a different mother than Thorgis, was now in charge of the settlement. Unfortunately, that's about all we know. For all his influence on how we understand Vikings, we know very little about Leif's passing, nor about his descendants. But he certainly wasn't forgotten. Today, Leif Erikson is everywhere in North American society. From the official Leif Erikson Day across America to his constant appearance in pop culture in shows like Viking's Valhalla. He was a calm, steady man who understood how to navigate the dangerous waters of both the globe and his people, and remains, along with his father, the epitome of the Viking. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page Factinate for more incredible facts about everything.